Hello, hello. Thank you for coming to the Shulgin Farm. How many people have never been here before? Okay, well, welcome. And for the people that are coming back, welcome back. You all have name tags, which is great. My name is Stacy, and I'm the programs director here, and I have the honor of putting on and curating different types of events, including this 4-part series this year around oral histories. And yeah, I'm so excited that both of these amazing human beings are here today. This is Maria, and Maria will introduce our guest today, but a little about Maria. If you don't know Maria, Maria is, to start off, a wonderful human. And she is part of the Hog Farm, which is a hippie commune in Berkeley and Laytonville. There we go. She's also part of our board at the Shulgin Foundation and has been in this space for so long and has such a rich history and so much to share. And I'm really, really, really excited to hear this conversation. I want to say hello to the people online. We have some folks tuning into our live stream. This will be recorded for those that couldn't join live. And if you have any interest about learning about our farm tours or events coming up, please come chat with me after. And without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic over to Maria. Thank you all so much for coming.
Well, when we talked about this, and especially when, oh, by the way, and to my right, this is Denis Berry. I don't really want to sum up exactly the reason why we would be wanting to have this conversation with Denis as a part of this series. And we were just starting to talk about this. We were having lunch at the famous kitchen table in the Shulgin house, where many, many, many members of the psychedelic realm have had meals at that table for a long, long time. And I was actually ready to sum up my introduction for Denis, and she said, well, it really isn't appropriate to introduce me as a psychedelic pioneer. And I said, yeah, and that'll be revealed if we talk about your biography. But what you are is a psychedelic hero. And Denis is, as I think will probably come out in this conversation, is responsible for some important milestones that have been important in the recent past, but I think more significantly are going to be important in the future. And as I'm thinking of the future, I'm thinking about like the next 100 years. And because of the way in which that has impacted that kind of history and future thinking, it's really enjoined with what's going on here, where there's a tremendous amount of psychedelic history that is looking for an opportunity to be preserved here. So Denis has had the opportunity to work through all of those trials and has been very successful with them. And I'm hoping we'll kind of work up to that as we get there. But when you say you're not a psychedelic pioneer, you didn't encounter these substances until fairly late in life, right?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, I sometimes tell people, people talk about their wasted youth. I sometimes say, well, I certainly had a wasted youth. I was alive all through the 60s. The first time I took LSD, I was 50 years old. So, I experienced the 60s in a very different way. I was going to college. I went to religious schools. We prayed a lot. And I saw it going on all around me, but I certainly wasn't a part of it.
Another thing that I didn't know about your biography is that, once again, this will all come out as we tell this story, but Denis has a long history with Timothy Leary and with Timothy Leary's. And I thought that actually that. But I'm telling all these little bits of your history. I just hope we'll just have them as like pins in the map. Denis lived in and was the roommate of Rosemary Woodruff Leary for most of a decade. Yeah, And I thought that it was her relationship with Rosemary that caused her to become involved with Tim and eventually with the archive that Tim had created during his professional life. But in fact, that's not the case. And maybe we should start by having you explain how it was that you came to know Tim. And I'm just going to introduce one thing because I think it's a good laugh line, which is that Denis used to have a business that was called Rent-A-Wife, Dial-A-Wife, Dial-A-Wife. And it's like somebody that you could rely on who would do things like go pick up your clothes at the cleaners for you and stuff like that. And because Denis is Denis in a way that you'll be able to recognize in a minute here, she's a very sunny and pleasant person to be around, as well as being really smart and efficient. So she was doing Dial-A-Wife, and then
So I had my Dial-A-Wife business and I'm living in Los Angeles, raising my kids. I had 2 kids at the time as a single mom. And I got a call from Tony Scott. I don't know if any of you know him. He's a brother to Ridley Scott. He's a movie director in Hollywood. So his assistant had called me to come up and do some shopping for them and delivering, picking up laundry, bringing it back, that kind of thing. And it turned out that Tony was just lived up the street from Tim. And they became friends somehow. I'm not sure how they met. But at one point, he called me, his assistant called me and said, we have a good friend. His wife just left him. He doesn't know what to do. He goes to the grocery store. There's a whole wall full of milk. He doesn't know what to get. Can you just go over? Can you go over and help him? He really needs to. He said, well, I won't tell you what he said anyway, but he said, I really want to help. So that's when I met Tim. I went over, I had delivered things there, like for Christmas, Tony would buy them a container of champagne, a whole case of it, and $100 worth of toys for Bo, which I think was their real connection, was Bo the dog. He was a beautiful golden, and Tony had a couple of labs that he adored, and the dogs spent a lot of time together. So that's how I came to meet Tim. It was just by going over to shop for him.
Do this with one microphone for the moment, so forgive me for interrupting. But now this, like those of you who know Timothy's psychedelic history and the sort of public persona and the sloganeering that he did before he went to prison, know that he used to say dope is your only hope. Then he went through a period where he said outer space is the place. And I think those two things were sort of sequential, but the period in which you met him, he was really starting to think about computers and the technologies that we're all sort of now swimming in. And maybe you want to say a little something about that.
Yeah, it was the mid-90s, and Tim had a computer, and one of those very basic first computers, but he I don't know if he just saw the future of this. In fact, I've seen interviews that he did on TV where you can just kind of see the host rolling their eyes as he's saying, every household's going to have one of these. We're going to be able to carry it around in our hand. It's going to be part of our life. And he really saw, and I think particularly the internet and the web, when that came in, it's like, this is the next frontier. It's like psychedelics had their time. That had been a wonderful frontier in the 60s and 70s. But now computers had come, and this was the next frontier. And he was very involved in that, and would travel and speak at conferences and do all kinds of things with the computers. He loved it.
It just makes me wonder, like I'm really interested in what are considered to be paranormal capacities, because this is my particular personal interest area in study right now. And I do think that there's a potential that psychedelics have for opening you up to the exercise of those capacities. You still have to, like anything, you still have to practice them to get good at them. But it does sort of open the possibility in very recognizable ways. So it makes me wonder, like, whether Tim was just a visionary, like whether he had a lot of images and implications for things that he could dream up himself, or whether he actually saw a vision of the future, like saw everybody going around with a cell phone in their hands, which I think is equally possible. And then there's also the Sunday comics of my childhood where Dick Tracy had the two-way wrist TV, so it may have just been something that was already known. But you didn't just do errands and stuff like that for that household. You had more involvement with them than that, right?
Yeah, well, not for my dial-a-wife. We just became friends. And Tim loved the idea of dial-a-wife. He loved the idea of group, kind of group involvement. And he was like, oh, you could do dial a philosopher and I could go out and talk to people. You could do dial a Republican aunt, have Thanksgiving. And he said you can dial a recalcitrant teenager. They'll come over and they'll eat all their food. They'll just lay around all day, watch TV. And when they leave, they'll borrow money. He said there's so many possibilities. So we really did become friendly, and we always had a good time. And unlike any other clients that I had, Tim had a way of kind of I don't know. I think it was a scientist in him, and you may not know this, but most people buy the same food all the time. It's just kind of what we do. And so he had a list of food and he numbered it. And so he would call me up and say, get me some 1, 3, 15. It was just kind of, that was the way he did it. So that was kind of an interesting take he had on it.
Well, now this once again is something that you probably already know, but like Timothy, through a series of misadventures when he was a public figure and was sort of holding out as the leader of a movement for which I don't think anybody ever actually nominated him to be the leader of, but he came to the attention of what we now recognize as a really pernicious kind of attention being paid to you by law enforcement because of your prominence in a political situation. And he was also not a bound person, not a lawful person. And as a result of some what are now considered to be really relatively minor infractions, he was sentenced to a very severe term of imprisonment. And during the time in which he was imprisoned on the first go, his wife, Rosemary Woodruff Leary, and some other folks who we'll talk about in a minute, figured out a way to get him out of the prison where he was. And he and she both passports and the help of some radical groups in the United States, left the United States, ended up in Algeria with Eldridge Cleaver, found Eldridge Cleaver's rules of social engagement to be a little too constraining for them, even those. At that point, Rosemary and Timothy separated, and Timothy went on to further adventures, which included becoming the object of the first extraordinary rendition committed by the CIA. He was actually kidnapped with his then paramour, whose name was Joanna Harcourt, from a plane in Afghanistan and brought back to the United States and re-imprisoned. But Rosemary, who had left him when they were still under Eldridge Cleaver's auspices, was now also a fugitive, but was on her own. And nobody was really quite looking for her, or at least nobody was able to find her in quite the same way that Timothy had been located. And do you want to tell a little bit about Rosemary's story from there? Because I think you probably know it better than I do.
Yeah, she went off with a man that they had been together with at Millbrook, and she and he took off and traveled incognito for years in Europe, South America, People have noted it was interesting that they would try to hide in small South American villages and near these two really tall, beautiful people, and how incognito could they have really been? But she did. They traveled for many years, and
More than a decade, yeah.
yeah, I think so. And she suffered some illnesses there. I think she never really recovered. She was a heavy smoker. She would never give up her smoke. She tried and tried, but it just wasn't going to happen from her. I think for her being a product of the 40s and 50s, women smoking was really kind of the bad girl, and which she, you know, always wanted and was. So yeah, I think it was.
Well, but we're fortunate to know some of this stuff and to have actually sorted through some of this history where Rosemary is concerned, because an author, a contemporary author whose name is Susanna Cahalan, has just published a biography of Rosemary in which she's very thoroughly researched all of this. And she debunked one of my favorite stories about Rosemary, I'm sorry to say, which is that Rosemary re-entered the United States by surfing or by water skiing behind a boat in Florida in a bikini. That's how she came back into the US. And I think it was not really quite that dramatic, although the water skiing in a bikini behind the boat was actually part of the picture. That just wasn't the way she came back. But she was able to function still as a fugitive in the United States in a few locations. She lived in the Northeast for a while. She ran some like bed and breakfasts and so on. And then she came to California. And did you and she met at Tim's, right?
Yeah, we met at Tim's one afternoon. I was probably there dropping off groceries or something. And she was there. The charges against her in Orange County had never been dropped. And so they had found someone that had agreed to pay a lawyer to take her case before the Superior Court in Orange County and to free her so that she could, she had gone under the name of Sarah Woodruff. Her middle name was Sarah, and Woodruff was her family name. So she had become known as Sarah Woodruff, the innkeeper. She worked as an innkeeper there, and when she came to California, she also worked as an innkeeper in Half Moon Bay, and she spent several years there.
And the two of you moved in together, yeah?
We did. She had been staying with a friend in San Francisco when she had days off, and I was just leaving California and moving to Santa Cruz. And so, and this was after Tim had died, I think, because we spent time at the house when Tim was sick and near death, and during and after his death.
So well, now if that's the case, then I'm going too fast. So we need to come back to this pin where you and she got to know each other and after Tim died. But let's talk about at the end of Tim's life.
Okay.
I was not a participant in that part of his story, but my impression is that he, as I think is true for many people who have deep experiences with LSD specifically and psychedelics generally, really didn't fear death and kind of looked upon the adventure of dying as the next great frontier challenge that he was going to encounter. I know that not too long before he died, Ken Kesey came with a bus and packed him up and brought him to my family's home up in northern Mendocino County for a celebration that we were having there. And I was very happy to be, I was the caterer for this rock show where I was supposed to produce about 6,000 meals that week, but I took the day off because Timothy was there. And I went and spent the day sitting with him and Kesey in the bus, drinking gin and tonic and talking about the stuff we're talking about now. And at the end of that day, Kesey canonized him with a cannon. So this was not too long before the end of his life, and he was kind of making the rounds of people that knew him and revered him and had been influenced by him. But he also, like, when you talk about like being around that scene, and I said, well, weren't you involved in some of the parties and so on? You said actually that really wasn't quite the case. Like you were more there to do important stuff.
Like I was the only one that had a job, actually. So, which is the truth. And yeah, I would get up every morning, go to work, and come home and hear what had happened all day. Tim did say that what he did when he learned that he had cancer and was dying, he let it be known, and he would go out, and he was a speaker, and so he would go out and he would talk about it, talk about how important this was. This is like the last great adventure in your life. You want to figure out how you want to do it, who you want there, what do you want to do. And everybody wanted to talk to him about it. He said it was the best PR movie he'd ever made. Was to let everybody know about dying and how you could recreate your death. So yeah, that was.
Now, during all the adventures that took place during his lifetime, this. Remember, I said there was a link here between the Shulgin Farm and the activities that are going on here and this story. Tim, like this, I'm fond of saying about the Shulgins, if your name was Shulgin, you never threw anything away. Tim was another one of those. And during his lifetime, he accumulated an archival record of all the adventures that he had been having, which amounted to, you told me how many bankers' boxes.
There were like almost 500 bankers' boxes that the New York Public Library bought.
Now let's not get ahead of the story. He spent some time in prison. He spent some time underground. He was on the lam. He had a certain amount of support in maintaining and sustaining that archive from other people who felt the importance of archival materials and who were committed to that. Toward the end of Tim's life, during this same epoch, there was in San Francisco a fully psychedelic library that was lodged in the Presbyterian Hospital complex. They actually had, I think, about half a floor in the office building of Presbyterian Hospital, where the Fitzhugh Ludlow Library, which was a library of drug materials, was actually lodged. And it was a wonderful thing to be able to go there and be in the library with all this stuff, because it was a really great collection of stuff. But at a certain point, they lost their funding. And the two fellows that had established that library sort of packed it up and put it in storage. Their names are Michael Horowitz and Michael Aldrich. And Michael Horowitz also had the experience of being the person whom Tim nominated to be in charge of his fiscal archival materials when Tim himself was not in a position to do it. So at the end of Tim's life, Michael was aware of the location of and had a certain amount of control over the physical archival materials. And it was clear well before Tim died that those materials were valuable and important. And you want to say something about that? Like, we'll kind of leave the New York Public Library, which is kind of the destination we're going to. But you said since 1980 that there was actually a conversation going on about the value of these materials.
Yeah, I went back through some of my old material, because this was 30 years ago and I'm old. So I just started to study up on it. But I found a letter from Michael that he had written to Tim, and he said we've just rented a car. They were living in a commune up in the hills or in Humboldt somewhere. And they had rented a car, a station wagon, and somebody who was keeping the archives. A lot of friends of Tim's had archives in their attics, some friends had paid for kind of real care for the archives and kept those payments up. But he was very frustrated because they had rented this car and were ready to go pick up the archives. And then the woman decided she wasn't going to let them have them. So that was part of his letter to Tim. But what I found funny was that they were already talking about selling the archives. This was like in 1980. So it was like, wow, that only took 30 years, So yeah, it was an ongoing process for a long time. And Michael was very instrumental.
And these are people who had already amassed this library collection that had actually been established as the Fitzhugh Ludlow Library. And I can remember being in conversation with them during this period because Michael is and still is a rare book dealer who really specializes in books that have to do with drugs and specifically psychedelics, particularly. And I used to rant to both him and Michael Aldrich, don't piecemeal out that library, like keep it together. It's really a treasure. And eventually, the Fitzhugh-Ludlow Library was actually sold to a collector in Europe, and it became part of the Santo Domingo collection, which now is lodged, not sold, but lodged on a loan to the Harvard Rare Books Library. So that library was able to stay together and is now in a setting where it can be accessed by scholars who want to come and consult what's in there. But meanwhile, the Leary Library was kind of in the wind. And, will you say more about that?
Well, Tim was traveling, he was arrested, he was in jail, and yet he really felt like the collection that he had was so valuable. So he found places to house it, like I said, friends. Every once in a while, we'll still get a call from someone. Well, I'm no longer a trustee. I retired 3 or 4 years ago, but we were always getting calls. My parents kept, we've got these boxes in the attic. They were keeping for Tim Leary. It's probably some of his archives. And so it's still, there's still archives coming in.
I skipped over the trustee part. As part of your invaluable service to the household and friendship with Rosemary and all that other stuff, you became part of the Futique Trust, which was essentially the agency that was charged by Timothy with managing these archives as kind of like literary executors, sort of not the same thing as literary executors, but you really had the management of the archive. And to whom did you actually try to shop it around? Was there anybody specific?
Oh, yeah, there were a lot of people who came to look at it. We had it in some storage facilities in Scotts Valley, which is just outside of Santa Cruz. And I know I forget if it was the University of Texas or Texas State, but one of them was very interested in the collection. But they were only willing to offer, I think it was $60,000. And, their library has a lot of historical documents in it, and it wasn't inappropriate for it to go there, but it just felt like the manuscripts were worth so much more than that. Harvard, you would think they would really want it because he taught there, and much of what was in a lot of, because when he was at Harvard, it was organized. There were office people, there were files, so that part of the collection had stayed together quite well and was very organized, like much of the rest of the collection. So he had approached Stanford about it. They had just purchased, was it Burroughs?
Burroughs Library is there.
Yeah, for $1 million. So of course he assumed, this is a no-brainer. Because of course his was more extensive, but spending $1 million on that archive. So I think again they offered him 50,000, something like that. So there were other people who were interested.
But this was like over a period of time. It took like 30 years, 20 years.
Well, if you count when Michael started, in the 80s, it was. I think I kind of shepherded them for about 12 years.
And how did the New York Library eventually enter into the picture?
Well, I'm trying to.
Let me stop a second while you think about that. Let me say something about the New York Public Library. I am the child of immigrants. All 4 of my grandparents are immigrants. The New York Public Library, my paternal grandparents lived in Manhattan. Immigrated to Manhattan and stayed there. The New York Public Library was like the temple of accumulated learning. It was the place where everything that matters could be found and found out, and where people, if they wanted to know something, would go there to find it out. And it was not the kind of library that I experienced as a child, where the main reason to go there was to find something that you could borrow and take home. This was an archival reference point that people actually went to and engaged with on the site. And it ranged from things like the personal records of people from the American Revolution and so on, to the daily newspaper that immigrants would come and read in the reading room so that they wouldn't have to spend the 25 cents to buy one. So, in my family background, there is this real reverence for the New York Public Library as an institution. And so the rest of the story really deeply resonates for me and matters to me because it represents a particular part of the social history of which I and a great many of the rest of the people who are here today were really intrinsically part, which was largely rejected by the authority level of our social experience. And then to have the reference materials and the records and the historic preservation of that period and that kind of thinking end up in that place is a really special validation in my particular opinion. So I just love this story, and that's why I wanted to talk more about it. So the New York Public Library expressed an interest in this, and then
Well, actually, there was a young man who came from, there's a bookseller in New York called his name is Glenn Horowitz. And I don't remember the hows and the wherefores, but one of his business associates, a young man named John McQuinney, came out and spent, I would say, maybe a week in the archives, and was just amazed by what he found there. And he wrote a critique about it. I looked all over for it because it was so beautiful, because he wrote about Tim's part of the archive, but what he really emphasized was it was really an archive that gave much of the history of the psychedelic movement. Not just, I mean, Tim's personal stuff was there too, but it was such a much broader collection than just Timothy Leary's archives. And John just raved about it and loved it. And I think what he did was he just went back to New York and talked about it. And then unfortunately, he was in a freak accident on vacation. He was swept away by a wave and died. And so when I called Glenn Horowitz and asked if he would represent the archives, because what I finally realized is that we really need a professional doing this. I'd tried everything. I'd showed it to so many people. And he came well credentialed. He didn't have a good reputation because he always got more than people thought it was worth. So that sounded good to me. And but I knew he was well placed. And so I called him and he agreed to it. And come to find out, he knew that the New York Public Library had just come into some money and they were looking for something to do with it. And he said, have I got a collection for you? And I think because of John's work and the emphasis that he had put on the importance of it, I think he was more willing to do that.
So they sent somebody out here to California where the actual physical materials were located with a panel truck. And they were going to pack the stuff up and take it back. And they looked at what was available there. And I think probably in a kind of slightly superficial way, for reasons that will come up in a moment, they left a lot of things behind because there was a lot of it. And the vehicle that they had brought to collect it really only had a certain capacity. And they took what they could take. They didn't take one of the things they specifically didn't take was all the newspaper clippings. It kind of makes sense because newspaper clippings, they're the kind of library that has an archive that contains that stuff already. But there was definitely other stuff.
Of them.
Yeah.
Boxes.
Yeah. So it moved into the library. Now, some things happened right after that, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But let's talk about what didn't go to the library for a second, because didn't you say that the newspaper clippings and some other what was labeled as detritus that wasn't of interest to anybody actually went in the dumpster, right? And what happened next?
And then Bruce Damer came to the rescue. He drove up in a little panel truck and just put it all in his truck and took it back to the Digi Farm. Or I'm not sure that's what he's calling it now, but so yeah, he was really he came in and saved that. I think what had happened was, how salespeople are. I think Glenn told them there were like 250 boxes, and then
The library.
Told
the library.
Told the library. About 250 boxes, and they got out here and they see there's more, like close to 500. So it was like overwhelming for them to try and figure out. I mean, some of it was obvious, but they just had to make decisions about space. How much space do they have at the library? How much, how much do they want?
And these are not people who knew really a whole lot about psychedelics. They were like, I have a list somewhere in a document which we have here, but I don't have on my lap. A list of the names of the titles of the different positions that people had at the New York Public Library that got involved in this, and they're all like named for magnates of the Robert Barron era. They're like endowed chairs of library collecting with big, upper class overtones. And these were not people who knew like one side of the psychedelic from the other one. So with the fact that Bruce got involved with this and was able to rescue all this stuff is actually a godsend. And the DigiBarn, the DigiBarn's a story in itself. He has like archival collection of computer equipment that goes back to a Cray computer that's as big as a telephone booth. And but there in the DigiBarn were all these plastic buckets, like people that I know in the cannabis world would put their crop in when it was getting about 3/4 dry, these giant like glass plastic trunks that were just filled with paper. And they were closed up, sealed up so mice wouldn't get into them. And he very kindly let me kind of wander around in there. And I mean, I'm telling you, this is the first box that I opened up. I opened up the lid. Right on top of the box was a first edition of Roll Away the Stone, a book about magic by Israel Regardie, autographed from Israel Regardie to Timothy. The next thing under that was a handbill for one of the psychedelic celebrations that Tim used to put on in New York, where he kind of pretended that he would be able to give people an experience that was like a psychedelic experience without any psychedelics. But somebody had taken the handbill and had kind of enhanced the graphic of the handbill with gold watercolor, and then turned it over. Written in pencil on the back was a trip report signed by Robert Rauschenberg. And this is like two things in a box, So it really, that was the stuff that the New York Public Library either didn't recognize or couldn't fit. But what ended up going to the library was another whole kettle of fish. And you want to say something about that?
All the rest of it. It was. You can't imagine what was in there, and most of it stained by a coffee cup ring. So that was how you there, and you go to the library and you see anything with it. That's how you know it's real. Because Tim would be drinking his morning hot, and of course put it down on the.
But in honor of the accession of this treasure into the collection of the library, Denis, as one of the agencies that made this happen, and some other social folk, held an opening celebration for the advent of this stuff becoming part of what you could access through the library. And there was a party. And it's right up there. I've been to some parties. I'm a hog farmer. I've been to a party or so, but this right up there with the very best parties I ever went to, because this was in the trustees' room of the New York Public Library, which is hung with these priceless 17th century tapestries. It looks like I wasn't allowed to be in there. And there were all these like tuxedoed waiters with napkins over their arms, serving like, caviar canapes and little cucumber cups and beautiful champagne. And then all the way around the perimeter of the room, there were these library vitrines, these glass-topped cases that you would display something from in a library. And the things that were in there were just unbelievable. They were unbelievable. There was a letter from the landlady of the house that Timothy had rented in the Berkeley Hills when he was running for president. And it was her catalog of all the damage that had been done to the house. And you could just, and then someone took a fork and scratched the top of the dining room table. And I thought, oh yeah, okay. There was his personal original copy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead with all the annotations that when he and Richard Alpert were creating their psychedelic guidebook that he was thinking about when that happened. There were scrapbooks from when he was at West Point and when he was a child. There were actual tests, the forms of tests that he had devised when he was a practicing psychologist, one of which was partly responsible for his having been able to break out of prison, because he had written the test that the prison gave to people to see how dangerous they were. And he knew how to play the test so that he didn't appear to be anybody that they needed to worry about. So they put him in a low security place, out of which he eventually broke with the help of some other people. But the stuff that was in there was just unbelievably wonderful. And then there were the people who came. And you want to say something about that?
Yeah, it was a wonderful guest list. The library had their guest list, and then I had sent them our guest list, and which was just as impressive as theirs, I have to say. And as Maria said, 1 3/4 of his 4 3/4 wives were there. Movie directors, Darren Aronofsky had optioned the rights to Tim Story twice, and he was there with some of his production people. Another writer who I'm blanking on his name now, but he was there. He had written one of the scripts for them, which they ultimately didn't use. Who else was it?
Robert Thurmond.
Robert, yeah.
Nana, who was one of the wives, and Uma Thurmond, who is their daughter. They were all there.
Winona Ryder.
And then, but the thing is, it was such an eclectic group because it was also a bunch of ragtag hippies from Millbrook. There were people that I hadn't seen in years that were like, the former people. And just to be in that place with that kind of aura of normalcy and acceptance and social integration and validation was a pretty amazing experience, not to mention very good food and wine. So that was lovely.
That was a great party.
And then furthermore, the New York Public Library has had that collection there for more than a decade. And it is now the most visited single private collection in the archives of the New York Public Library. Lots of people want to see that material. And I think that probably is indicative of the ferocity with which we should really pursue and persist in making sure that what is here, which is equally important and equally irreplaceable, gets a proper place in a proper institution where scholars of the future are going to be able to get a look at it. Because think about this, this is a joyful gathering and we're in a lovely place and this is a friendly group, and I'm sorry to have to bring up politics, but if you consider the determination which the current agencies of our government are trying to reverse and, if possible, eradicate some of the transformations that took place in the last half century, the fact that this stuff exists as a material record of that all having actually happened is extremely important. And now, in a time when the technologies of artificial intelligence and the possibility for things like deep fakes and all that make it possible for people to take reality and play with it and adjust it and reform it. There's something about paper archives that have coffee cup stains on them that is not subject to that kind of depredation. So I think it's really important for us to take care of that business. So I want to say something about that?
Yeah. Yeah, me too. No, I think it's critical, and it's true. There's something about touching the paper, touching the letter, from William Burroughs, and reading the funny article from B. Hoffman, and just all of it, just seeing it, holding it, reading it. I think it really makes a difference. Yeah.
And the people who experienced that period that Leary archive specifically represents, and to a certain extent the Shulgin archive too, because the demise of the elders who are primarily responsible for having collected the Shulgin archive was more recent. So the archive itself is more recent, was still being added to even just a few years ago, but still, like this, I think I made the point that this is historically important, but I also want to make the point that what I'm thinking of when I say historically important is not next week. I'm thinking about what's going to be like in 100 years, when all the people who had direct experience of this period and the things that happened during this period have gone, and what is going to be left to refute the idea that it was all somebody's imagination, which it was not. And the fact that you all are here is an indication of how correct that point of view really is. So here we are. And maybe we should take some questions. Yeah. Do you have a question? Do you want a microphone?
So I know two people who've been involved with Leary toward the end of his life and after, and I'm curious what you can say about either one of them and what roles they played. One is John Perry Barlow, and the other is Lisa Rhine.
Lisa Rhine had dinner with us the night of the fabulous party that I'm talking about. She was definitely part of that mixture.
The after party, the after dinner.
Yep.
Yeah, John Perry Barlow and Tim, as you know, were very good friends. In fact, I have a picture I brought that shows Tim Ramdas and John Perry Barlow at the table at Tim's house, just because that's such a great story that he had. Yeah, John was very supportive of everything that Tim was doing. I remember when Tim was really sick, and John Perry showed up in a convertible, and he had a lot of young people around him always, and some working for him, and some of the young women got in the back seat of the convertible, and they're spinning their way down Sunset Boulevard, and these girls are sitting up on the back of the seat and cheering, and of course they get pulled over. And John talked their way, here's my friend, he's sick, he's dying, and Tim's like a shadow of himself. And the cop was very amenable and said, you got to sit down, just go on your way, but you got to sit down in the seat. And then Lisa had, at some time toward the end of Tim's life, she had met with him and promised him that she would digitize his archives. He really, at the end of his life, was really concerned about what was going to happen to this collection. And so she was able to get a lot of interest, particularly in the tech world, because she knew you guys, and the Brewster, yes, yeah. Brewster Kale, yeah, and so that was really helpful, and also helped find a cheaper place to store them. I mean, can you imagine how many boxes that were, and how much money we spent in all those years just trying to keep them safe? So she had definitely helped with that. She was really a big help at that point, and that was after Tim had died. Yeah.
So did she end up putting up a website full of his scanned stuff?
I never saw it. I don't think so. I don't think so.
If you visit the New York Public Library, there's a lot of stuff that's been scanned that you can actually explore that archive very remarkably well.
Yeah, there were a lot of videos, a lot of
and all the scrapbook photographs. They're all up on the web. All that stuff. Oh yeah. If you want to explore that stuff, you can. So we would love to have your questions.
Hello. I have a question about talking to elders about establishing archives in a way that is delicate and supportive and that maybe includes some budgeting. I have one person in mind where I would love to get started while that person is alive and has so many amazing things to contribute. But at the same time, I work with people at work who are end of life or widowed, and it can be a really rough conversation. There's sort of a lack of denial that needs to be in place to have it really meaningfully. And I'm just wondering, how do you start this conversation with your elder or psychedelic elder about preservation?
Well, some of the things that are relevant there have actually come out in relating the history of how the Leary archive came to end up in the New York Public Library, in that somebody has to care, somebody has to physically preserve the material, somebody has to figure out whether it's worth money, somebody has to find someone who has the money. If the person is depending on the value of something like that represents the accumulation of their life work to sustain them in their old age, you can't just let it go anywhere. I mean, although you might be brought to the point of having to let it go anywhere by circumstances, these are all like things we've already talked about, really. Before I go on, you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I don't, I really, I felt a very grave responsibility to do something with these archives. That was really kind of my focus when I took them. And I didn't have a clue what you do with archives, but through, trial and error. And, but I never really tried to get individuals to because no individual, not none, but hardly any individuals would have a big enough place or would have the wherewithal or the desire to collect that many boxes. So I don't really know how you would go about. It would have to be somebody who was really interested in the project for sure.
Well, I think you're also talking about people who have accumulated archives to make sure that those archives don't get scattered to the wind when that person maybe dies or has to move. And that's another whole collection of stuff. And when Stacy was identifying me to you all, for those of you who don't know me, I'm part of an organization called the Women's Visionary Council. And the Women's Visionary Council originally was formed because I and the other two founders, one of whom is here, raise your hand, Annie Harrison, recognized that the circumstances of women in the scholarly and research and therapeutic and cultural environment around psychedelics was asymmetric, that women were underrepresented in all of those areas, and that somebody really ought to make a concerted effort to change that. So we started the organization largely with that as our mission. But when the pandemic took place, and our organization did as I think many other ones did, took that break as an opportunity to really take stock of what we were and why we were the way we were. We recognized that, for all intents and purposes, our mission of changing the role that women play in the environment of psychedelics had prevailed. That women, if you look at the major organizations that have anything to do with psychedelics now, they all either are headed by women or have significant officialdom and representation and administrative help and all that kind of stuff, where women have actually figured out how to do all that. It's not necessarily because of us. I mean, it was time for that for sure, but we also have had a lot of success with that. But what we recognized was that our determination to change the way that those opportunities that I just listed would be available to women was equally applicable to the psychedelic elders and pioneers. And the same kind of disadvantages that appertain to women really had something to do with those folks as well, because I appreciate that now I could have a conversation with any of you in a restaurant about taking LSD, and I wouldn't look over my shoulder to see who might be listening. But believe me, in most of my life, that was not the case. And the pervasive, overhanging possibility that something that was deeply important and majorly sacred and special in one's life also could put one in the position of being put in prison, or losing your credibility professionally, or financial ruin, or having your family think that you should be hatched somewhere, or any of those kinds of detriments that accumulated in the last century because of affiliation with psychedelics. They didn't set the people who were persistent in those points of view during all that time up for prosperity. A lot of those people are not in a good way right now because they just, they were paying attention to something else, and the social environment did not elect to support them or their ideas or ideals during that time. So there is I'm now talking about the current mission of the Women's Visionary Council, which I think of as two missions. One of them is that there are still a number of these psychedelic elders and pioneers, people who've been at this for most of a half century, who are still living, some of whom really could use some support from the younger people in the community, like material support, or just go over with a pot of soup, or companionship, or listening to their stories, that kind of stuff, or, actual material support. I have some specific ones. I think it's probably not wrong to mention this because it's been mentioned publicly in a meeting about psychedelics within the last few months. Norma Lotsoff, who is the widow of Howard Lotsoff, who figured out that ibogaine might be something that could be used to interrupt addiction, is still living in the same third floor flat in Staten Island that she's lived in for probably the last 40 years, but she uses a wheelchair now. So if she doesn't have an attendant to help her get in and out of her home, she doesn't go anywhere. And, somebody should raise $10,000 and help her move, really. I mean, that would be a straightforward thing that somebody could do. That's that kind of thing. The other thing is that this is these, when I said the record that is going to be consulted in 100 years needs to be created now so that it's there for people to consult in 100 years. Part of that record is the life stories and the oral histories of the people who actually experienced the things that we're talking about. The difficulty with that is what I have frequently referred to as a limited time offer. And if you think about just in the last few weeks, in the last month, Jean Houston died. In the last week, Robert Thurman died. These people are dying now. And if we don't make a record of the stories they have to tell us, those records will not be here for us in the future. And this is more important even than the sort of march of time aspect of its importance than that, because of the social pressure that was created by the drug war. The archival materials, the archive that lives here, the Shulgin archive, was created under the auspices of a particular kind of, I guess you could call it immunity, that Sasha functioned under because of who he was, what he knew, and achievements that he had already made, so that with very few exceptions, he was not harassed very much and was not overlooked with the idea that the stormtroopers were going to come in the window and you might have to eat the code book. So this archive is very complete. But I know I personally have been at this since I was 16. That's 60 years now. I have hardly ever moved in my life. I still own almost every personal letter that has been written to me in all that time, except that when the social environment started to get heated and I started thinking maybe I have to move to New Zealand, I went through all my paper archives and purged and burned things that I thought would get me or somebody else into trouble. So there's a big hole in that archive, and that I'm using my example because I know it well, but I'm not the only one. And there is a big gap where paper records of that time and those activities ought to be, either because they were not created because people recognized that they might be dangerous to make, or because they did create them and then they thought, oh, wait a minute. So we have doubly difficult circumstances. And that makes the importance of the oral histories extremely important, because there is not a robust paper archive to fulfill that gap. And the oral histories are extremely important. Now, the thing about oral history is that oral history is a scientific activity. There's a lot of academic and scholarly and library-oriented rules about how one goes about establishing and obtaining and establishing it, which is that's fine. You know, they all have to do with who owns it and who can use it and where it's going to be housed and all that kind of stuff. But the difficulty is, remember what I said about this being a limited time offer? Like, while we're wading through all that paperwork, people are dying. And then there's this other problem, which is that the two of us, forgive me, I'm really talking a lot, Dennis, but the two of us are having a great conversation here, because we're talking about something that both of us experienced and that we know, and we don't have to explain our jokes to each other. You know, if you want to get these stories from the elders, the very best way any way to do it is fine with me. But in my opinion, the very best way to do it is to bring them together and let them talk to each other, because they stimulate one another's memories, and there's a feeling of companionship, and there's also a certain amount of safety in a situation where there's been a lot of unsafety for a very long time. And the habit of conducting oneself as one ought to do when there is unsafety is very baked in to these people. So really, ideally, what we really ought to do is convene some gatherings of elders to make an opportunity for them to present this kind of material. And that actually is my specific interest and focus, and to a very great extent it's the focus of the Women's Visionary Council. Also, we've agreed that the business of the psychedelic elders and pioneers is our business, and that we really want to pay attention to that. So we keep looking for the right solution for that. The thing is, you don't want to dawdle looking for it for too long, because the opportunity to do it at all is not going to be there forever. So that was a long speech.
That was a great question and great response. Thank you both.
Just in thinking about the sort of holes in the psychedelic history, especially around the political risks and the current political risks, I feel like the current political risks around the sort of knowledge destructive capacities of fascism are in some ways the same and in some ways very different than the kind of political risk faced by this community prior. So I'm wondering, how can we preserve that sense of what it was really like to live with that raw sense of needing to constantly look over your shoulder when you were trying to have these conversations, and what it meant to keep these things sacred in that context, and almost trying to preserve that like felt sense of history so that isn't lost?
Dennis, I wonder if this is kind of springing this on you in a certain way, but like, I would love to know Rosemary's answer to that question. Like, what was that like, having to disclaim and disguise and dissemble for 12 years, you know?
She actually was undercover for more like 25, actually. Even after she came back, she lived out in Cape Cod, ran an inn out there, and then of course moved to Half Moon Bay and ran an inn there. What was the question? Once the charges were dropped around her, I think she was finally able to call herself Rosemary again. She started calling herself Rosemary Leary. She was able to kind of, it's like she had been like the queen of psychedelics. This was this beautiful woman, and they were like the king and queen of, the psychedelic community. Just they were kind of the masthead on it, and it had to have been so disappointing to disappear, when you've kind of been in that situation. And I don't think that she ever got over that. She told me even when we lived together, I still know where my shoes are every night when I go to bed, in case I have to get up and run. So it's the kind of thing that doesn't really leave you, you know.
I think a lot of people have, either because of their natural personal resilience or because of some contribution that the experiences that they had that psychedelics provided for them, produced in them, have managed to survive that pretty well. I mean, next time we do this oral history event, we're going to have Carol Randall here, and she is another one who has, the depredations of the war on drugs have been felt extremely by her and by her family. And yet she is she's a jolly, sunny, productive, interesting, colorful individual. She hasn't been defeated by that. But there are a lot of parts to this that are often not very well examined. Like, I'm working with a young woman right now on a podcast that she's been producing for the last little while, where she decided, once again, this was like the hiatus that took place during the pandemic. She decided that she was going to do some interviews with people in her family. Now, the reason this was of interest to her was that when she was growing up, her parents supported her family by being pot smugglers. So just about everybody that she knew, as all the adults in her life were outlaws. They were all dope dealers or smugglers or counterfeiters, people who made documents for people and stuff like that. And she said, I started out interviewing my mother, and then I interviewed my mother's friends, and then I interviewed my friends' mothers. Well, when you think about who those people are and when you listen to the interviews and what those stories are that those people told, they are stories that anybody else except this young woman who is part of the smuggler family would not have gotten these stories out of those people, because they never would have told anybody this stuff. But she pursued them, encountered them, recorded them, and preserved them. And now there's about 35 of these interviews that, I don't really care that we didn't follow the protocol for collecting oral history that the library recommends. What I care about is that the damn interviews exist, and that they will be preserved, and that those stories will be told. And that, in fact, when that story was being told, most of the time the person telling it felt perfectly confident to reveal things which they maybe hadn't ever told anybody outside their family about. So this is think about it. Historians of the future eat this stuff for lunch. This is what, if you are in pursuit of history, this is the kind of stuff that you would most like to find someplace to play with. And we have an opportunity to create that for generations that are going to come in front of us. And it's just an incredibly worthwhile thing to pay attention to.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, both of you. I have a question about the work that the Women's Visionary Council is doing. And I've also heard that UC Berkeley had some interest in building a project that would actively begin to cultivate and collect. And so is that happening with the WVC? Is that a project you are all focusing on or working on? Or is this an inspirational, we should do this together right now, and who's in?
Both. The Women's Visionary Council has some characteristics which I can enumerate for you. One of them is that it's the oldest organization of psychedelic women, was the first one. Another one is that we've been doing certain things, including making grants to psychedelic elders, oftentimes ones that were in need, over a period of getting close to 20 years now. So we have a good reputation for stewardship for that kind of thing, and the ability to exercise discernment about that sort of thing, which I think recommends us for future process of that kind. We're an extremely colorful and diverse group of women, and over the time that we've been in existence, we've accumulated a really interesting group of both the current board and emeriti, like Denis, who is one of them. However, we are small. I have had a lot of conversations with people who represent themselves to me as being in touch with people who are in a position to produce big time funding, like the kind of funding that it would take to do the project I was just describing, where we would convene some elders and we'd get them to all spend a few days talking to each other. That could cost a big chunk of money. And I have been told by people that we're so small that people who give big money to organizations that do things like that wouldn't give it to us because they only want to give you a fraction of what your budget is. Like they don't want to tip your Apple Card over by giving you too much money all at once. I can't imagine that would be any kind of a problem. But so we don't really have the funds to do a lot of things that we have all the other tools that one needs to do some of this stuff. I just keep going around the countryside and mentioning this. I am a little bit deficient in the part where I actually ask people for money. I mostly just say we need it, and I hope that in the goodness of their hearts, the people listening will hear that, and that some support will come in that way. But we've been the recipient of some really ferocious generosity. Some of it is present for this meeting today. But we're still broke, and I tell anybody who gives us any big amount of money, well, yeah, this is great. And we have some expenses that we need to pay, but basically we're going to give it away as fast as we can. We've done a thing that we've called the Laura Huxley grant, where we've given money to somebody for it. The grant has a very specific set of restrictions that go with it. You can only use it for yourself. You can't give it to your grandchildren. You can't donate it to another foundation. It has to be used for your own health, pleasure, or well-being. And that has been, I know I can think of some significant psychedelic elders who actually needed that money and benefited a lot from getting it. One I can think of right off the top of my head bought herself a new bed, So we do that. But really, what I would really hope is that somebody would recognize that we are a long-lived and reputable organization that has all these contacts and a history of stewardship, and give us a chance to execute on some of these plans, because we've got some really good plans.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kate. And but in Santa Fe, we're a little group of us is starting a Center for Psychedelic Elderhood. We've had events where we end up actually bringing in money that then goes to other causes. New Mexico will have end-of-life care with psilocybin mushrooms on target for the end of this year. And it just feels like a place where things can happen. So also I had friends who went and interviewed Jack and Ricky Coddington last winter, just in time. So there is a lot going on. I'm also interviewing people in the area of death, dying, and expanded states of consciousness. And I was going to do 30 interviews. Now I've got a list of 100, because there are things, but that's like an emerging field. It includes the paths that got people there, but it's also catching something that is just coming into being now. So,
well, in Santa Fe, you're right there in a little nest of people that are really interested in this and ready to make it happen.
Yeah.
And that's another little nucleus of energy that's producing all this stuff. But like, as I keep saying, we better do it now, do it now. Eat the ice cream. It's only melting,
there's a long history in Santa Fe and New Mexico, but also a quarter of our population is 65 or older. So it just feels like it's time. Thank you.
Well, you did mention Ricky Coddington, and Ricky is a dear friend of a lot of people here. And Ricky just died this year. And the example of trying to make it work, Ricky, first of all, because because the primary part of her work was underground, she was very reluctant to reveal who she was, where she was, and what she was. And it took a long time to talk her into the idea that it was safe for her to even do that. And time was rolling on as that was all happening. And at a certain point, it was clear that if we were going to collect the materials that we hope to get from her within the constraints of what would have made them, say, attractive to the University of California, which might have given us some money to go get those materials from her, she was going to be dead before we could pull it off. It was too much bureaucratic stuff for that to really work. So we actually sent someone from our organization to interview her, and we were able to make a recording of an interview with her that I'm hoping we're going to distribute. And I mean, we're definitely going to distribute. It's alongside another recording that we made at one of our congresses some years ago, toward the end of Anne Shulgin's life, where she came to speak at one of our events and gave a talk. She gave an hour-long talk about her notion of the Jungian shadow, which is now, you can get it on YouTube. And Anne would have said that was the best talk she ever gave about the shadow. So, you know, I keep putting these little crumbs of history out here to you because we know how to do this. We're actually really good at it. What we're not really super good at is having money rain out of the sky. But if you know how to make that happen, that would be really good. So is there another question? Oh, I see one.
Hi. So I'm very aware, living and working in Oakland, of how special a place Oakland is and how much of this history takes place in Oakland. And yet I very, very rarely see elders from Oakland, particularly elders of color. I think that there is a double, triple, 10x pressure around prohibition. I mean, people who certainly wouldn't try to talk about it. And so I'm wondering what your experience has been like trying to record those stories where the speed of trust in the community is so slow, and the current political pressure is so incredibly high.
I think you're recognizing something that is really, really exists. This is like trying to talk about the Middle East, you know, like, what can you possibly say that covers all the incredibly diverse and disparate territory that's under consideration? What I have decided to do about the issue of inclusiveness of the particular kind that I think you're addressing is to know what I am and who I am. And I'm a psychedelic relic. It's 60 years since I had my first encounter with LSD. I have plenty of experience. And what I have decided to do with that is that I am an historian of Euro-American psychedelic use in the last 100 years. And I know a lot about that. And I try not to be invited or enticed to talk outside my area of expertise, because I find that it's, first of all, a minefield. And secondly, I am not an expert there. So I realize that that's kind of I don't want to answer your question answer, but it's the best answer I can come up with. And I have found that there are certain important questions that are asked so frequently that it's a good idea to have somewhat of a pat answer for them. It's like many people in my life have asked me, should I take acid? And I have an answer for that. The answer is, that's like asking if you can kiss me. If you have to ask, the answer is no. Right? But that's a pat answer, but it's a good answer. So my answer is, I can only really talk about Euro-American history of psychedelics in the 21st century and 20th century. I know there's a lot of other stuff, but it's not from me.
Any final questions?
This is a total out of left field question, but on the note, psychedelics as a tool for psychic development, if you were going to give us a sort of training regimen, what would you prescribe?
Well, ask me in a month, I'll probably have a lot more data, because I'm going to, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to Lilydale. And Lilydale is a small town, a hamlet, basically, in upstate New York, where mediumship has been taught and practiced since the 19th century. And I'm going to give a talk there called Spitting Out the Apple, because I think that, I mean, this is, let's see if I can give a short summary of this. I think that, well, I was raised in the Roman Catholic Church, and I was raised fairly vigorously and comprehensively in the Roman Catholic Church, and in an intellectual tradition dominated by Jesuits in the Roman Catholic Church. And particularly, I was in Catholic high school, and the anticipation was that I was going to go to some university where people were going to try to attack my religion. So I got a lot of robust religious education provided to me to indemnify me against that, including some information about what the Eden story was actually about. And my understanding of that, which I'm excavating from my personal archives back there from like centuries ago, is that when the fall happened, the first couple didn't just get thrown out of the park. They actually lost some things that were part of the natural endowment that humans are supposed to have and be able to experience. And Catholic catechism and scripture and teaching has some descriptions about some of this. Immortality was one of the things. Death was a new phenomenon. And another thing that was lost was what is called natural knowing. Natural knowing. Natural knowing is being able to know, grasp, and understand things which you don't have to study. And that to me sounds a lot like clairvoyance and mediumship and finding lost objects and time travel and all those other things that we label as psi phenomena. Now, what I think is that those are normal capacities that mostly humans are supposed to have, but where are they? You know, and that's like asking, where is the ability to wiggle your ears? You know, I mean, you have the muscle that will wiggle your ears. It's just not everybody can find it. So what I think has happened with those things is that the social pressure to suppress, repress, denigrate, deny, and oftentimes punish people for evidencing those capacities has been so severe that we've most of us matured through a period of what I'm using a lot of terms that are terms of art and science, and I may not be using them in the way that the scientists to whom they belong would use them, but we may have, most of us pass through a kind of neuroplastic period where those things are natural to us. I mean, you know, how many little kids do you know who have imaginary friends? You know, but the social pressure not to acknowledge that those things are real and to develop the capacity to attend to those experiences and work with them moves into the background as we mature in the habit patterns that we are allowed to develop. There is an analogy for this, which I've used a lot, which is that the idea is that is amblyopia. Amblyopia is a phenomenon. Your eye movement is controlled by extraocular muscles. And if the muscles are stronger on one side than the other, your two eyes don't focus on don't converge on the same point. One eye might be looking over here and the other one's looking out here. There is a period between about the ages of 3 and 5 when your brain is learning how to accept the images that come from your eyes and process them. And if you don't intervene to get that the brain does not want to do what's confusing. So when the other eye wanders and you get double vision, which is what happens, the brain just rejects that image and stops receiving it. And if you've ever seen a little kid wearing an eye patch, what they're doing is they're patching the eye that doesn't wander to make sure that they use the eye that does wander so that those neural circuits do form. Because if you don't form them, at least the historic thinking about this was, if you didn't form them during the crucial period, then they wouldn't form and they couldn't form. And what you'd end up with is an eye that was physiologically intact, but functionally blind. So you can't see out of that eye because your brain won't take what it offers it. I think there's a lot of things like that. And what I think psychedelics do is they reopen those potential pathways so that people can see, you know, if I don't look right at it, there's a fairy over there in my left peripheral vision, and that fairy is not going to like it if I stare. So if I just keep my eyes focused straight ahead and pay attention to what's going on over there, maybe the fairy will tell me something useful, you know, like stuff like that. But you can't just do it. It's like waking up one day and thinking you can play tennis. You know, you have to practice. And I think that's one of the things that we can maybe do if we can get out from behind that thing of saying, oh no, that's, and it depends on what's your perspective. Some people think it's just hokum. Some people think it's demonic, So there's a whole realm of possibility there, which is potential for us to explore. And I hope I'm going to come back from Lilydale with a little more information about what kinds of, like physical therapy for your psi capacities, like how to build it up,
Yes, thank you, Maria, for everything that you just said and for introducing those topics which deserve to be recognized and so rarely are. And also, Kate, I was very drawn to what you were talking about working with in Santa Fe, and if I understood you correctly, with psychedelic people approaching death. And I believe that that is a bridge that is so valuable to pay attention to explore, to accompany each other on. I remember Tim Leary saying, dying is the greatest adventure of your life, and it's worth spending a lifetime preparing for it. So I think the marriage of what you were just saying, what you are doing, and the fact that we're all headed towards that great adventure, and to be able to open it up with the psychedelic awareness and perspective and worldview and encompassing all of these things together, I just think is so valuable and so needed. And I thank you for what you're doing. I thank you for bringing it up. And I invite all of us to join in that endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm going to do my best to articulate what I'm feeling. I haven't slept in like 18 hours. I just came off of a flight. And I did just really resonate though with what you shared, which I've not heard as much from you, which because I've been to a few events. I was just at Tram Day a couple weeks ago. So thank you. This more like woo-woo, not just psychedelic, but especially centering around women's abilities. And I don't know if this existed already, but I hadn't heard it, and sort of discovered this term I call witch wounds after just getting real witchy with my girlfriends, finally just kind of leaning in. And what you shared really resonated with that realization and remembrance, really, of acknowledging, I'll just speak for myself, a seemingly nonsensical fear that I really believe roots in this intergenerational, epigenetic
Witch hunting?
Yes. Suppressing of exactly what you just really beautifully explained. And psychedelics can be an ally and an access point to be able to remember that and practice it. And I wanted to just share that, and also gratitude because the Women's Visionary Council has been a portal also for me to share in community with other women at various levels of even just subconscious, even if I'm not quite cognitively, intellectually getting it, there's a very visceral remembrance. So thank you for creating that.
I have to stick another little thing in here, and then I think we're going to come to a close here pretty soon. The other area that I'm really interested in and really trying to study now is the writing of a woman who was part of the International Foundation for Internal Freedom, when Timothy and Richard Alpert first left Harvard. She was kind of the front desk for that scene. She was the person who gave like harm reduction advice. She helped people with dosage levels. She kept a mailing list of people who were interested in this kind of subject. She produced a series of 39 psychedelic information center bulletins, which are fascinating in terms of the cogency of the advice that she provided to people over a period of time. But what she did that I liked the best is she was the producer of two pamphlet-length essays. One is called Session Games People Play, which is basically tripping instructions. The other one is called Finero Time. And you may recognize Finero Time as the alternative term that is not the word psychedelic, that was in question when Humphrey Osmond and Aldous Huxley were trying to figure out what the name by which these substances should be called was. And the reason this little piece of writing is called Finero Time is that she was ready to disown the word psychedelic because she felt that it had become associated with what she called gaudy, unreadable posters and slum districts where hippies live. And this is because she was a profoundly spiritual person, and she really recognized that this was a sacred experience, and she did not want it to be vulgarized. And she wrote about it just beautifully in this pamphlet, which is called Finero Time. It's been reprinted by the Illuminous Press. You can buy a copy of it for $5. And it's a really important piece of writing, even though it's almost 60 years old. Her name was Lisa Bieberman, and she is a really important and inspiring female ancestor. Unfortunately, she is deceased, but her writing has outlived her, and I would recommend you take a look at it if you get a chance.
So I think those are most of the questions. I know we didn't have questions from our online folks, but thank you to the online folks for joining. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Denis, so much for being here and sharing so much. I look forward to continuing oral histories. The next one is Sunday, September 13th. So we hope to see you here or online. And we'll stick around for a little bit after this. And if there's any questions about events or any questions about what you all talked about, will you be available for a few moments after? Okay, great. Well, thank you all so much. And yeah, looking forward to getting to know you guys. Bye online, folks.